A mail-order contract brought her to the wrong ranch, and the cowboy swore she'd never face danger alone. Before we begin, take a moment to share your city. Where are you listening from tonight? And when the story's over, don't forget to give it a rating from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. She said, "I have nowhere left to go." He said, "You've got me, and that's enough." Montana Territory, late spring of 1888. The wind came down off the far mountains, still carrying a knife edge of winter cold as it swept over pale green fields and a river streaked with the last gray meltwater. The stagecoach rattled, slowed, and finally rolled to a stop in a yard swept with yellow dust in front of Rushing River Ranch. She stepped down, her long skirt brushing the dry grit, both hands locked around a letter creased, rain-stained, the ink blurred by last night's storm. That letter had carried a promise of marriage. But the man who'd written it, Thomas Radley, had been dead for 4 months. She looked around, nothing but emptiness, silence. Somewhere in the distance, cattle called low. The barn door swung open. A tall man stepped out, broad-shouldered, hair the color of ripe wheat. His eyes weren't cold, but they weren't hurried either. He simply held out a hand and spoke, his voice deep and certain. "You've got me, and that's enough." And in that moment, there in the bite of the spring wind, her loneliness was no longer absolute. The front yard of Rushing River Ranch stretched out under the hard light of late spring, sunlight glaring off the dust still clinging to the coach wheels. Far off, the lowing of cattle mingled with the rush of wind along the fence rails. Gwendolyn stepped down, feeling the ground take her weight as though it meant to hold her there. The hem of her dress was worn, the brim of her bonnet shadowing most of her face. She still clutched the letter, its edges softened with handling, the ink running into pale blue shadows. A man stood by the fence, his shadow long across the dust. Lawson Reed, the ranch owner, took the letter from her, reading it slow and careful. It only took a few lines to understand. Thomas Radley, the man who'd promised to marry her, was gone since winter. She lowered her head. There was nowhere left to turn. The sun seemed heavier, the creak of the barn door louder in the silence. Lawson folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and said in that same steady tone, without a trace of pity, "You came all this way on the strength of a promise, and I won't let you stand alone." It wasn't a fairy tale beginning, nor a vow of riches or grandeur, but it was enough so that afternoon, in a dusty ranch yard, Gwendolyn knew she wouldn't have to face the wind by herself. Part 1. From temporary guest to someone who belongs. The next morning, Montana's cold still slipped through every crack in the walls, but the ranch kitchen was already warm from the wood stove lit before dawn. The first light of day streamed through the small window, catching on dust motes drifting lazily in the air. The kettle murmured softly. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the smell of cornbread just pulled from the oven. Gwendolyn stood by the rough-hewn table, apron tied around her waist, carefully setting warm slices of bread onto a plate. Her hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the weight of standing in a place still entirely strange to her. Lawson stepped in, the thud of his boots low and steady on the wooden floor. He didn't speak right away, just hung his hat on the wall peg, washed his hands in the basin by the window, and took a seat. Gwendolyn placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, the rising vapor, a thin fog between them. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice deep and even. She nodded, turning back to her work as though she had done it 100 mornings before. No one had told her she could. No one had given her permission. But Lawson let her move freely, saying nothing, only watching eyes steady and quiet, as if reading a story not yet written. Later, as he rose to head toward the barn, she hesitated, Could you tell me the names of the horses out there? I'd like to know. He stopped in the doorway, the corner of his mouth tugging upward, not quite a smile, but enough to soften his gaze. All right, but remember them, right? Or they'll take offense. And that was the first moment between the smell of coffee, the whisper of the kettle, and the hush of early light that Gwendolyn no longer felt like just a passing guest. The pale morning sun laid a thin wash of gold across the dirt yard before the barn. The horse's breath rose in soft white plumes against the cold air. The smell of hay, leather, and a hint of horse sweat wove together into the ranch's familiar morning scent. Lawson led Gwendolyn through the barn door, the hinges giving a short, rusty creak. Inside, the stalls lined up neatly, each horse poking its head out at the sound of approaching steps. He stopped at the first stall, resting a hand on the neck of a chestnut gelding. His voice stayed calm and low. This here's Red Hawk. Fast, but a little stubborn. Don't let him see you're scared. Gwendolyn reached out carefully, brushing her fingers through his mane. Red Hawk sniffed her hand, then lowered his head, as if granting her a quiet acceptance. One by one, Lawson introduced the rest. Jasper, the black with bright eyes. Daisy, the gentle mare who hauled supplies. And finally, Flint, a tall gray whose intelligent gaze hinted at something harder to win. Flint only listens to someone he trusts, Lawson said, his eyes flicking briefly toward her. Like most of us, the words made her lift her head and meet his gaze. Neither of them smiled, but in that short moment, she felt a thread form between them. Tied not with pity, but with recognition, she lingered at Flint's stall, softly repeating his name. He neither stepped forward nor shied away, only looked at her for a long while before lowering his head enough for her to rest her hand on his muzzle. Behind her, Lawson stood with arms crossed, saying nothing. He let her take her time, let her find her way into the ranch world at her own pace. That evening, the sun slipped slowly behind the far mountains, leaving a thin trail of red across the sky. The wind carried the bite of coming night and the scent of fresh-cut hay. Gwendolyn stepped onto the porch, holding a plate of warm cornbread. Butter and honey filled the air, mixing with the soft, resinous smell of the cabin's timber walls. Down the steps, Lawson sat low on a stool, one knee up, rough hands threading leather through a bit of worn tack. "Have you eaten yet?" she asked. He glanced at the plate, then back at her. "Not yet, but I reckon I just got invited." She smiled. Setting the plate on the step between them, Lawson broke a piece in half, handing her one without a word. They ate in quiet, the only sounds the wind in the fence rails and the slow breath of the horses in the barn. When the bread was gone, Lawson went back to his work. Gwendolyn stayed, watching the sure, unhurried movements of his hands. Every so often, he'd hand her a strap to hold or ask her to test the pull on a knot. She began to understand. Trust on this ranch wasn't given in grand speeches. It was built in moments like these. A piece of bread split in two, a leather strap held steady between them, and a silence that didn't feel distant. When he tied the last knot and hung the bridle on its hook, he spoke without looking over. "Tomorrow, if you'd like, I'll let you try." And with that, the feeling of being a temporary guest shifted one shade closer to belonging. At dawn the next morning, roosters crowed from the backyard, the sound mixing with the lowing of cattle across the fields. Frost still clung to the grass, and Gwendolyn's breath showed white in the air as she stepped outside. Lawson was already on the porch, at Brimlow, boots dusted with the thin haze of morning frost. "Come on," he said, handing her a pair of worn gloves still warm from his pockets. They walked past the fence to the east pasture, where a few ranch hands were gathering the horses. Gwendolyn spotted Jasper and Daisy right away, their names coming naturally to her lips. Both turned their heads at her call, drawing a few surprised glances from the men. Lawson said nothing to them, just passed her a bucket of feed. Daisy. First, she's gentle. Jasper waits, or he'll steal the lot. She did as told, still a bit clumsy, but focused and without hesitation. Daisy ate easily. Jasper waited, patient or pretending. It was hard to tell. When the feeding was done, Lawson walked her to the chicken yard. Plenty of eggs this morning. Mind the hens. Some of them have opinions about strangers. She laughed, the sound warmer than she'd expected from herself, and moved among the coops with care. For the first time, she felt herself moving to the rhythm of this life, simple, steady, enough to fill the spaces inside her she hadn't realized were empty. From a short distance, Lawson watched, not to hover, but to be sure he was near if she needed him. And she realized respect wasn't in telling someone what they could do. It was in letting them do it and trusting they could. When the morning's chores were done, they returned to the kitchen. Lawson said only one thing, but it stayed with her. You did good today. No added praise, just a quiet affirmation she'd been longing to hear. That night, the rushing river wind slipped through the porch rails, carrying a deep chill. The lantern light from the kitchen spilled out, pooling warm gold around Gwendolyn as she sat on the steps, hands wrapped around a cup of herbal tea. Bootsteps sounded behind her. Lawson appeared, holding a neatly folded handkerchief. He didn't sit right away, just looked out over the yard where the horses' silhouettes stretched long under the moonlight. This, he handed it to her, for when the wind cuts hard in the morning. She unfolded it. The cotton was soft, the edges sewn with careful stitches, but not a woman's work. The seams were firm, a little uneven, as if made by someone working quietly, determinedly. In his own time. You made this yourself? She asked. He shrugged, eyes still on the dark horizon. Just keep warm. Who made it? Doesn't matter. She smiled, folding the cloth again, but keeping it in her lap. Here. Care didn't shout. It came in small things, a scarf handed over on a cold night. A presence close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Lawson stepped down into the yard, heading toward the barn. Before the shadows took him, he looked back. Tomorrow, you'll ride Daisy. A short sentence, but to Gwendolyn, it was an invitation to step deeper into this life, not as a visitor, but as part of the ranch. Part 2, the storm and the trust. That afternoon, the Montana sky changed faster than a blink. By the time Gwendolyn was setting baskets of eggs on the kitchen counter, the wind had begun to whistle through the cracks in the door, carrying the scent of damp earth and a strange, icy edge. Out on the horizon, black clouds piled on top of each other, heavy as a wool blanket about to fall across the whole valley. The first crack of thunder rolled low and deep, rattling the window glass. From the porch, Lawson's voice cut through the sound firm. No room for hesitation. Leave it. Get to the barn now. She didn't ask why. She just ran after him. The ground was slicking over fast under the sudden sheets of rain. By the time they reached the barn, the air was full of panicked neighing and the pounding thud of hooves against wooden floors. Lawson shoved the barn door open. The hanging lantern swung wildly in the wind, its light slashing across the stalls. Inside, the horses were circling, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Rain blew in through the gaps in the walls, turning the floor to slick mud. Red Hawk spooked, and Flint. Lawson's voice was quick, already moving toward the far stall. Gwendolyn caught the flash of movement. Flint, the big gray, tangled hard in his lead robe. The loop cinched cruelly around his neck. Each frantic pull only tightened it more. Lawson was locked down with Red Hawk, fighting to keep him steady. She didn't stop to think. She splashed through the muck toward Flint, the sound of hooves hammering close enough to feel in her chest. One hand grabbed the rope. The other searched for the small knife hanging on a post. Her fingers shook from cold and wet, but she found it, sawed hard, and the rope gave with a snap. Flint threw his head back, stumbling clear. His breath came fast and hot, but he was free. Gwendolyn backed against the wall, heart pounding like a war drum. In that moment, Lawson turned, catching sight of her soaked through, hair plastered to her face, but eyes still sharp, chest heaving from the rush. His gaze lingered a beat longer than it should have, as if he'd just seen something in her he hadn't expected. The rain roared so hard on the tin roof, it drowned the thunder. Water ran in cold rivulets down the walls, and the lantern light wavered in shaky halos across the wet floor. Lawson got Red Hawk settled, then glanced her way. "You hurt?" "No." "Flint's fine now," she said, still catching her breath. He secured Red Hawk's stall and crossed to her, taking her hand before she could protest. He turned it gently, checking for cuts. His palm was hot and steady against her chilled skin. "Don't take a risk like that again," he said, voice low and rough from the wind. One kick, and if it were you, she cut in, eyes steady on his. "You'd have done the same." For a long second, he didn't answer. The sound of horses breathing hard, the drum of rain, all seemed to pull back to make room for that small, charged silence. He drew in a slow breath, like he wanted to speak but thought better of it. They went back to work, Lawson telling her to hold the lantern close while he checked each stall, making sure every horse had dry hay and their ropes clear. Each time he passed near her, the heat of him cut through the cold, seeping into her spine. When the last of the stalls was secured, Lawson turned to her, the lamplight caught in his eyes. "I don't want you to leave." The words fell heavy and unpolished, like they'd come straight from the truth without being dressed up. She stood still, breathing in the scent of wet wood and hay, knowing the storm wasn't only outside, it was circling in here between them. The rain softened, falling in thin, lingering drops against the tin roof. The barn was warm now, with the smell of horses, and damp timber. Lawson turned the lantern low, nodded for her to follow him. The mud sucked at their boots as they crossed the yard under a moon just breaking free of the clouds. At the porch, Lawson stepped ahead, then turned back. He shrugged off his outer coat, heavy with rain, and draped it over her shoulders. "It's heavy," he said, "but warmer than standing out here shivering." She smiled faintly, tired but genuine, pulling it closer. The lingering heat from his body chased some of the river chill from her bones. Inside the kitchen, he set the kettle on the wood stove. The scent of burning oak and rising steam filled the room. She sat at the bench, fingers curled around the mug of tea he handed her. Lawson sat across from her, watching as she took the first sip. The firelight threw a soft gold on their faces, and in that quiet, she knew. "I don't want you to leave," wasn't a moment of weakness in the storm. It had been in him long before. Outside, the rain stopped at last, but in the small wooden kitchen, another kind of storm still swirled, silent and deep. The next morning, Montana wore a pale wash sky, as if the whole land had been rinsed clean. The air was bright and sharp, with the scent of damp earth and new grass. Gwendolyn stepped into the yard to find Lawson in the barn, moving slow and sure down the stalls. His hand rested on Flint's neck, giving a quiet nod when the horse kept eating hay without a hint of last night's panic. She came to stand beside him, no invitation needed. "Flint's fine," he said, eyes on the horse, thanks to last night. Before she could reply, he turned toward a wooden peg on the wall and took down a saddle old, but cleaned until the leather was soft again. Tied to the horn was a small board of sanded wood, the letters carved in careful lines. Gwen. She looked at him, startled. For me? No. He adjusted the cord, setting the saddle on the rail. For Daisy. But whoever rides Daisy uses this saddle. Call it marking territory. Her fingers traced the carved letters, the grain warm and certain under her touch. No paperwork, no vows. But Lawson had just told the whole ranch she wasn't an outsider anymore. You sure? She asked quietly. He met her eyes, a faint, almost private smile passing there. After last night, I've never been sure. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse blew through its nose, and the wind teased the cottonwood leaves into a hush, as if the whole place had paused to let his words settle into the space between them. Part 3. The Shared Journey. At first light, a thin veil of mist lay across the valley like a silver blanket. The lowing of cattle rolled deep through the open fields, echoing off the far cliffs. Lawson was already in the yard, leading the horses out. The reins hung neatly from the saddle horn, and a leather pack was tied down tight behind, holding dry bread, salt-cured meat, and a few other things for the trail. Gwendolyn stepped outside in a gray wool coat, her hair braided neat down her back. In her hands was a small cloth bundle scarves and a spool of thread she thought might come in handy. Lawson glanced at it, nodded, as though it was the most natural thing to bring. Bozeman's 3 days, if the weather's good, he said, eyes scanning the horizon. We'll camp by the river tonight. They mounted up, driving the cattle along the dusty trail. Hooves struck a steady rhythm, the grind of grit and stone underfoot mixing with the low shuffle of the herd. Neither spoke much, but the space between them seemed to close a little each time Lawson reined in to wait for her, or when she moved Daisy into place without prompting, pressing the herd back into line. By midday, they stopped in a patch of fresh grass. Lawson split the bread and handed her the water canteen. She noticed he always poured his share first, but made sure she drank before he did. It wasn't showy courtesy, just the reflex of a man used to thinking of someone else before himself. By the time the sun dipped toward the ridges, the far mountains burned copper in the fading light. Lawson gave a small tilt of his chin. Another hour, and we'll see the river. She nodded, drawing in the evening wind, cool and damp, with the scent of water and moss. Deep inside, she knew this trip wasn't like the others she'd taken. It wasn't to leave something behind, but to find what might be worth staying for. They reached the riverbank, under a sky sinking into indigo. The last thread of sunset wrapped the horizon like a strip of silk. The water ran cold and clear, quick over the rocks, carrying the eternal whisper of Montana's wild land. Lawson chose a rise above the bank, close enough to hear the river's voice, far enough to be safe if it swelled. He pitched her shelter, nothing more than canvas and stakes, but it stood firm against the night wind. Nearby, he built a fire from the dry limbs they'd gathered along the way. Flames leapt high, throwing gold across their faces, chasing the river, chill from the air. The smell of roasting meat mingled with wood smoke. Gwendolyn sat across from him, rubbing her hands for warmth, watching the sparks spin upward before vanishing into the dark. "You been to many places?" she asked, voice low, as though she might disturb the water's surface. Lawson turned the meat slowly on the spit, glanced at her, and answered, after a pause, "Plenty, but never found anywhere I wanted to stay. Just lived out the days." She lowered her eyes, running a thumb along the edge of her scarf. "Me too. Thought if I could just get to a different place, it'd all be better. But no matter how far I went, nothing felt like home. For a while, only the fire spoke its crackle, joining the river's steady song." Lawson finally passed the skewer across the flames. his gaze still on the fire. Maybe to me, it's not the place that makes you want to stay. Maybe it's the person you'd stay there with. She looked up, catching his eyes over the firelight. No more words were needed. Something unspoken, but certain passed between them, and they ate without hurry, letting the river and the flames say what they weren't ready to. The night wind swept in off the water, slipping through the layers of cloth. The fire burned lower, leaving only the steady glow of embers lighting their faces. Out in the dark, the herd lay scattered like quiet shadows. A few low rumbles from deep in their throats, folding into the river's current. Gwendolyn pulled the wool blanket tighter. Lawson leaned forward, tossing a few more sticks on the fire. He didn't look at her when he spoke, his voice slow and quiet. I almost settled once. Wyoming, small plot, timber barn, a few good horses. But one winter, the blizzard came, took it all, including the reason I'd stayed. She hesitated before asking, the reason? He exhaled, breath white in the cold air. Fiancé. She didn't make it through that winter. Her hand gripped the edge of her blanket. The fire popped softly between them. I made promises too, to someone who didn't keep them. Leaving town wasn't about finding something new. It was about not having to see what was left. He looked up then, meeting her eyes. There was no pity there, only the understanding of someone who had been hollowed out and still kept walking. Maybe, he said, voice barely above the wind. What we're looking for isn't shelter. Maybe it's the proof that we're still alive. She nodded. No more was said. But in that silence, they both knew their rhythms. After years of running out of step, had finally found a way to match. Somewhere, out in the dark, an owl called once. The river flowed on. The night stretched wide and long, but the Montana cold didn't cut as deep anymore. Morning broke with drops of dew clinging to the grass, shining under the newborn sun. The rushing river, black under last night's sky, now ran like a sheet of silver, swift but calm, mirroring the soft blue above. Lawson was already up, tying the ropes around a few sacks of oats on the horses' backs. Gwendolyn stepped from the tent, rubbing her arms against the chill. Her hair was still mussed from sleep, but her eyes were clearer than any morning she could remember at the ranch. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, steam curling into the air. Careful, still hot. She took it, the warmth seeping from her hands into her chest. They stood side by the river, saying little, listening to the herd further off. Then, without a word, Lawson handed her a small knife, the wooden handle worn smooth. Keep it on you. Might need it. It was mine, but I reckon it'll do more good with you now. Surprise flickered across her face, then a smile not polite, but real. You trust me that much? Lawson took a sip from his own cup, eyes still on the river. Trust you enough to know, if I'm not there, you'll be all right. And in that moment, she understood this trip wasn't just about moving cattle to market. It was a test, a way for Lawson to see they could stand together beyond the fence lines of the ranch, and she wanted that. Above them, a flock of geese carved a V across the sky, their calls spilling down to the rushing water below, carrying with them the first breath of a new season. Part 4. The decision to stay. Late in the day, the shadow of the mountains stretched long across the valley of Rushing River Ranch. The herd moved slowly through the gate, their backs dusted gold, catching the blaze of the setting sun. Hoofbeats, the jingle of tack, and the low calls of cattle blended into the familiar sound of coming home. Gwendolyn rode Daisy, bringing in the last small group. Her dark gray riding cloak was powdered with trail dust, but her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been before. After the long drive, she moved with the easy rhythm of guiding a herd, at home in the long silences broken only by the sound of hooves and wind on her cheek. Lawson rode ahead, swinging the gate open. When she led her group in, he held his horse steady and waited, saying nothing, but letting the faint curve of his mouth serve as a welcome home. They unsaddled side by side, the leather creaking in the quiet of the barn. Lawson hung his bridle on a hook, then reached for a new wooden sign, larger than the one that once carried just her name. The fresh cuts in the wood were deep and certain, the letters carved firm, Rushing River Ranch. Lawson and Gwendolyn. She froze, fingertips brushing the smooth edge, feeling the grain as though it were something living. When did you make this? Before the drive, he said, eyes still on the sign. But I'd only hang it if I was sure you wanted to stay. She lifted her gaze. In the last light of the day, his eyes were deep and still, like the surface of a lake before a storm. And now you're sure? He set his hand lightly over hers, where it rested on the sign. We built this place together. You're not a guest here anymore. This is your home, too. Inside her, something closed. Not a door, but a long chapter of wandering. That night, the ranch kitchen was warmer than usual, not just from the fire in the stove, but from the presence of everyone gathered at the long table. The air was thick with the smell of beef stew, fresh bread, and strong coffee. Lawson sat at the head of the table, as always, but this time, the chair beside him, the one usually left for a passing guest, was set with a brand new plate, a full glass, and polished silverware. Gwendolyn hesitated for half a second before Lawson gave a small motion of his head. Sit here. She took her place, her palms warming on the worn, smooth wood. The ranch hands, who'd once only nodded politely, now asked about the trip to Bozeman. She answered in her slow, careful way, earning small bursts of laughter, and was surprised to find they were listening, not out of courtesy, but because they wanted to when the meal was nearly done. Alma, the ranch's cook and keeper of its kitchen, brought out a pie. She set it right in front of Gwendolyn. For you, Alma said, made it myself. Welcome home. For a heartbeat, the table went quiet, except for the pop and hiss of the fire. Gwendolyn blinked once, then smiled a smile, without guard or caution. Lawson's gaze found hers. It wasn't bright, wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of certainty. In that moment, she understood. She'd stepped from the place of a stranger into the place of someone who belonged. The next morning, the fences and chicken coop roofs were strung with dew, catching the early sunlight in 1,000 tiny points of light. The steady cluck of hens mixed with the scent of dry straw and the low warmth of cattle out in the pasture. Gwendolyn opened the coop, basket on her arm. She reached into the nests, taking each still warm egg and placing it gently in the basket. Lawson leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching. They're tame, she said without turning. Her voice was light, carrying a peace she didn't often feel. They know who takes care of them. She looked over her shoulder, smiling faintly. I'm just helping like a guest would. He stepped inside, close enough for the morning light to fall in long stripes across them both. He reached into the last nest, setting the final egg in her basket. No, guests leave. You're not a guest anymore. The words were plain, but in that space, they weighed like an oath. Not a promise on paper, or with a ring, but the kind of truth a man speaks only when he means it beyond question. Gwendolyn tightened her grip on the basket's handle and nodded. From that moment, she knew when she thought of home, she would think of this place, and of him. Part 5. Building a home. Winter wind in Montana carried a whistle sharp enough to pierce through the thickest coat. Snow clung heavy on the ranch roof, sliding off in hushed avalanches whenever a hard gust struck. But inside the log house, warmth breathed from the hearth pine resin crackling in the fire, the scent mingling with fresh baked bread. Lawson stood on a wooden ladder, replacing a weather-worn board along the porch eaves. Gwendolyn sat below, folding new canvas tarps they'd bought in town, occasionally holding one up to the window frame for size. On the table nearby lay a hammer, a box of nails, and a coil of rope, evidence of a day full of work. "Another windbreak here will keep it warmer," Lawson said. Reaching down for the board, she passed up. "And I'll sew a heavier curtain for the kitchen window," she replied. "This winter, we won't have to dive under the blankets before supper like last year." He gave that quiet, half-hidden smile that only showed when his hands were busy. Words weren't needed. They both knew they were shaping this house into something that could truly stand against the season. By late afternoon, snow fell thicker, each white flake spinning in the wind before vanishing against the window panes. Lawson climbed down, brushed sawdust from his coat, and stood beside her, looking out. She drew her mother's old apron, soft from years of use, close around her. His eyes moved from the apron to her face. "Keeping what you love," he said, "is part of building a home." She nodded, eyes following the way the snow melted on the warm wood of the sill. In that silence, they both knew the house was built not just of boards and nails, but of every winter they'd weathered together. When the snow melted, the air filled with the damp scent of earth and the first stirrings of spring. Runoff from the hills sent ribbons of water racing toward the valley. In the backyard, the once frozen ground was soft and dark, dotted with green shoots. Lawson drove the blade of a hoe into the soil, marking straight rows. Gwendolyn rolled her sleeves, hair wrapped in a scarf, gloves already stained with dirt. Beside her sat a basket of seeds, pumpkin, beans, carrots, and a few young apple trees they'd brought back from Bozeman last year. "Pumpkins here," she said, measuring the space with her eyes as if she were arranging a picture. "Beans along that row," he replied. "I'll set up a trellis strong enough to handle a good harvest come fall." As she planted, memories surfaced of the small garden behind her mother's house in Kansas, where she'd knelt as a girl to press seeds into the dirt. But this was different. These seeds would root in a place she had chosen to stay, not simply pass through. Lawson pounded stakes for the apple trees, each steady blow into the earth carrying the quiet promise, "We're staying here for good." That evening, they stood back, looking over the neat rows, the fresh stakes, the space they'd claimed with work and trust. "For the first time," she said, brushing the soil from her hands, "I'm planting for more than one season. I'm planting for years." He took her dirt-streaked hand and squeezed gently. "And we'll harvest together." The spring breeze stirred the scent of fresh earth and the river beyond, like a silent vow that this was only the beginning. Summer in the Montana Valley came like a full-handed greeting. Golden light spilling across pumpkin vines, bean rows taller than a man, and apple boughs heavy with green fruit. The hum of bees, the rustle of leaves, and the sweet tang of dry earth and sap filled the air. Gwendolyn stepped into the garden with a willow basket, her cotton dress billowing, her mother's apron faded but soft against her waist. Ellis, their 4-month-old son, slept in a cradle slung beneath the shade of a cottonwood, his tiny breaths matching the hush of summer. Lawson came from the barn, bits of hay still clinging to his shirt, and set a full basket of green beans on the porch table. He crossed to the cradle, adjusted the patchwork quilt Gwendolyn had sewn through the long winter. "He sleeps like you," Lawson said quietly. "Nothing but peace." She smiled faintly. "And like you, he stays wherever the peace is." They gathered pumpkins, pulled carrots, and hung the green apples under the porch to ripen. Lawson laughed a low, warm sound when she tried to carry 3 pumpkins bigger than her arms could hold. It wasn't loud, but it was full of a joy he rarely wore on his face. By late afternoon, when Ellis woke, they brought him out to the porch and sat in the wooden chairs. Lawson balanced the boy in his lap, Gwendolyn resting her head on his shoulder. The smell of apples, pumpkins, and sun-warmed cloth wrapped around them. Full and quiet. "This season's beautiful," she murmured, looking at the tidy garden beds. "But next season, we'll do even better." He gave her hand a squeeze. "We've got plenty of seasons left." At the end of August, a strange heat wind came up from the south, carrying the scorched scent of burning grass. The sun hung low and red, like a disk of heated iron. Crows flew low and silent. Lawson was checking the fence when he saw a smear of smoke rising on the western edge of the pasture. Without a thought, he swung into the saddle and tore back to the ranch. "Gwen, buckets, tell the others. Fire." She didn't ask questions, just ran to the well, dropped the bucket, and began hauling water. Alma and 2 ranch hands joined in, filling and passing pails. Ellis slept inside. The cradle moved near the kitchen door where Alma could watch him. The fire had begun licking at the dry grass, the wind pushing it fast. Lawson dug a brake line with a shovel, blocking its path. Gwendolyn soaked the grass along the fence to keep the flames from catching. Sweat and ash streaked her hair and face. When the wind shifted and flames leapt closer, Lawson caught her arm. "Back. Don't risk it." She pulled free, seizing another bucket. "This is my home too. I'm not backing off." The words rang sharp and hot as the fire itself. Lawson met her eyes for half a breath, then handed her another full bucket. They fought for over an hour, until the wind eased and the fire choked down into smoking black earth. Standing there, breathless and covered in soot, their hands found each other and held tight. "I knew you belonged here," Lawson said softly. "But today, everyone else knows it too." She smiled, tired but blazing through the haze of smoke. By late autumn, the valley glowed with the gold of cottonwood leaves and the russet of nearly bare apple trees. The air carried the kitchen scent of wood smoke and dried hay, the kind that kept a body inside instead of out roaming. The ranch had changed since their first winter together. The roof was tight, the porch mended. The thick curtains Gwendolyn had sewn sealed every draft. The garden held not only vegetables and fruit, but a new chicken coop built after the fire, solid and safe. Ellis, now crawling, played on a quilt in the porch's warm patch of sun, stacking little blocks of wood as if building a tiny ranch of his own. Lawson sat nearby, carving a long plank into a bench, each stroke of his knife sounding steady as the heartbeat of the place. Gwendolyn stepped out from the kitchen with a basket of the last apples. She set it down on the porch table, wiped her hands on her apron, and sat beside him. They didn't speak right away, just watched the pasture where the horses grazed slow under the sinking sun. "How many seasons have we seen now, Lawson?" she asked, her voice drifting with the wind. "Enough to know. There'll be plenty more," he said, setting the knife aside and turning toward her. She nodded, adjusting the quilt over Ellis's small legs. "This house, we built it from little things, and maybe that's why it's strong." He didn't answer with words, only took her hand broad, warm, and as certain as the day he'd first held it at the ranch gate. The sky deepened into the color of honey, and as the shadows lengthened across the valley, Gwendolyn knew with perfect clarity this would never be just a shelter. This was the place to stay always. Ending, nothing given, everything built. Late in the day, the valley lay under a thick, warm pour of honey-gold light. The cottonwoods along the river shifted in the breeze, their leaves gilded in the sun's last glow. The log house by the porch looked much as it had years before, but inside, every scratch on the kitchen table, every stone in the hearth, every stitch in the curtains told the story of two people who stayed not out of debt, not out of pity, but because they wanted to. Lawson worked on an old saddle, the steady sound of leather under his hands. Nearby, Gwendolyn mended her mother's worn apron, the fabric soft from years of use. Ellis, now running on his own two legs, came bounding across the porch with two fresh-pulled carrots in his small fists, his grin wide and unguarded. "Can I put these in the pot, Mama?" His laughter joined the whisper of the wind and the quiet clink of wood in Lawson's grip. All those sounds together wrapped around the life they had made, not a gift handed down, but something they'd built side by side, day after day, from plain suppers to planting seasons, from long nights tending the fire through storms. This home was their work. Gwendolyn had first come to this place on the weight of someone else's promise, but she'd stayed for her own, for the vow she'd made to herself to build a home with her own hands, her whole heart, and every season yet to come alongside Lawson. Lawson glanced over, his eyes fastening to hers like a tie that didn't need words. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll still be here." And the day after that, the sun slid off the roof, leaving its warmth in their glances, in the small brush of hands as they passed one another. Neither of them waited for happiness to be given. They'd built it board by board, seed by seed, breath by breath together. Tell us, what did this story stir in you? Drop your thoughts in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a ride. Do you believe the strongest love is when both choose to stay, not just when one person needs the other?